Nothing exploded on television. No emergency address interrupted the evening. No headline screamed that history had shifted. And yet, within a short span of time, three quiet moves landed on Nigeria at once. U.S. airstrikes, foreign troops, and a royal invitation that hadn't been extended in 37 years. On paper, each move looked ordinary. Security cooperation, diplomatic courtesy, trade as usual. But together, they formed a sequence that felt intentional, almost rehearsed. This wasn't noise, it was timing. Something was being secured before anyone could debate it. Something was being legitimized before anyone could question it. And something was being locked in before the public even noticed the door closing. Nigeria didn't suddenly become important, it became necessary. Necessary to stabilize a region breaking away. Necessary to reassure a system losing control. Necessary to hold a line others had already crossed. The question isn't whether Nigeria is being welcomed. It's why the welcome arrived now. Let's find out. The welcome arrived now because control was starting to slip, and Nigeria sits exactly where slippage becomes dangerous. For years, Western powers managed West Africa through a familiar setup: security partnerships, intelligence sharing, quiet bases, and cooperative governments. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable. Then the northern edge of the region broke that predictability. One by one, governments above Nigeria stopped playing along. Military agreements were canceled. Foreign forces were told to leave. Intelligence pipelines dried up. Influence didn't decline slowly, it fell off a cliff. That collapse created a geographic problem. Nigeria is not just another country on the map. It is the southern wall beneath the Sahel. Everything that spills downward, fighters, weapons, migration pressure, instability, ideology, passes through or around Nigeria. If Nigeria remains aligned, the damage can be contained. If Nigeria drifts, the entire lower half of West Africa becomes uncontrollable. That is the context in which the U.S. airstrikes suddenly make sense. They were not a reaction to a new enemy. They were a signal sent at a very specific moment, a reminder that Nigeria is still inside the Western security perimeter, a way of reasserting presence without asking permission, without debate, and without turning it into a spectacle. This is how modern power behaves when it's anxious. You don't wait for a crisis. You act early, quietly, and just forcefully enough to reestablish relevance. The strikes weren't about winning battles. They were about preventing strategic drift, making sure Nigeria's security architecture remains interoperable, dependent, and connected to Western command structures. Once that happens, choices narrow. When intelligence flows one way, you listen more. When equipment comes from one source, you adapt to it. When coordination becomes routine, independence becomes theoretical. That's why the military move came first, not to punish Nigeria, to bind it. But binding through force alone creates resistance. People tolerate it, but they don't internalize it. Governments accept it, but they don't defend it publicly. Over time, resentment grows, and resentment breeds unpredictability. Western planners know this. They've watched it happen repeatedly. So the military move needed a second layer, something that would make alignment feel normal, respectable, even desirable. Something that would calm elites, reassure investors, and tell the world that nothing unusual was happening. That second layer could not come from Washington. Too blunt, too political, too exposed. It had to come from somewhere softer, older, symbolic, trusted by institutions even when distrusted by people. That is why, almost immediately after the security groundwork was laid, the tone shifted from force to ceremony, from strikes to smiles, from aircraft to carriages. The airstrikes answered the question of control, but they raised another question just as important. How do you turn a security anchor into something that looks like a voluntary choice? You turn a security anchor into something that looks voluntary by changing the story people tell about it. Force creates obedience. Legitimacy creates acceptance. That's why the answer didn't come from Washington, it came from London. After the airstrikes did their quiet work, The next move had to calm nerves without undoing control. Investors needed reassurance. Nigerian elites needed affirmation. Other African governments needed a signal. And most importantly, the alignment had to stop looking like pressure and start looking like a choice. This is where the British monarchy becomes useful. A state visit hosted by King Charles III is not just a diplomatic event. It is one of the oldest legitimacy machines still operating in global politics. It carries no legislation, no troops, no sanctions, yet it reshapes perception more effectively than all three. Nigeria had not received this gesture in 37 years. That absence wasn't accidental. State visits are not friendship rewards. They are tools deployed when reassurance is required. Britain uses them when a relationship needs to be stabilized, not celebrated. Inviting Bola Tinubu to Windsor Castle does something very specific. It reframes recent events. The airstrikes stop looking like an intrusion. The troop presence stops looking like pressure. Everything begins to look coordinated, orderly, mutually agreed upon. That reframing matters because global systems run on confidence. Markets don't like uncertainty. Elites don't like ambiguity. Institutions don't like unanswered questions. The Crown answers those questions without saying a word. It tells banks that Nigeria is still safe. It tells allies that Nigeria is still inside. It tells rivals that Nigeria is not drifting toward rebellion. And it tells Nigerian power circles something even more important. This government is internationally backed. That backing doesn't require speeches. It doesn't require promises. The image itself does the work. The carriage, the banquet, the setting. These are not aesthetics. They are signals encoded for people who understand power. But here's the crucial part. Legitimacy is not aimed at the public. Most Nigerians don't care about Windsor Castle. Many actively distrust symbols of empire. The real audience for this ceremony sits elsewhere, in boardrooms, ministries, embassies, and regional capitals, watching quietly. That's why the visit comes after the military move, not before. First, you secure alignment. Then you normalize it. Then you present it as continuity. Once that happens, resistance becomes harder to organize. Criticism can be dismissed as instability. Alternatives can be framed as risk. But legitimacy on its own still doesn't hold forever. Ceremony fades. Photos age. Headlines move on. So the alignment needed something heavier than symbolism, something that would remain long after the visit ended. Which raises the next question. What turns temporary legitimacy into long-term obedience without ever looking like control? Long-term obedience is created when rules replace pressure. That's where trade enters, not as commerce, but as architecture. Once the royal visit reframed alignment as normal, the next step was to make it durable. Military presence can be debated. The ceremony can be forgotten. But trade frameworks quietly survive governments, protests, and even crises. They sit in contracts, courts, and regulatory systems long after headlines fade. This is why the UK-Nigeria economic relationship matters far more than its headline value. The £8 billion figure isn't impressive by global standards. What matters is how that money moves, under what laws, and who arbitrates disputes when something goes wrong. Modern trade deals are not about exports and imports, they are about locking behavior. Once a country signs into these frameworks, a subtle shift happens. Industrial policy stops being purely national. Protecting local industries starts triggering legal consequences. Changing regulations suddenly risks lawsuits. Currency, data, procurement, energy, everything becomes entangled in obligations written elsewhere. This isn't theft. It's formatting. Nigeria doesn't lose sovereignty overnight. It loses freedom gradually, in small technical decisions that never make the news. Every policy choice begins to pass through a filter. Will this violate the agreement? Will this scare investors? Will this trigger arbitration? That's how obedience becomes self-enforcing. No one needs to threaten Nigeria once the system punishes deviation automatically. The discipline comes from paperwork, not power. From clauses, not commands. From fear of instability rather than force. And this timing matters. Trade frameworks don't land before legitimacy. They land after. Once elites feel reassured, once alignment looks respectable, once the country appears stable, the economic rules slide in quietly. By the time people start arguing about them, they're already binding. This is also why trade agreements are rarely explained clearly to the public. They're technical by design. Dense language, vague promises, long documents no one reads. The real effects only appear later, when a government tries to do something different and discovers it no longer can. At that point, resistance looks irrational. Change sounds reckless. Independence gets framed as irresponsibility. And here's the uncomfortable part. This system doesn't need corrupt leaders to work. It functions even with good intentions. Even reform-minded governments find themselves boxed in by agreements signed earlier for stability. That's the brilliance of it. But there's a flaw no contract can fix. People don't experience trade frameworks as text. They experience them as outcomes. Jobs that don't appear, prices that rise, industries that never quite take off, and eventually, questions. Which leads to the problem that no amount of legitimacy or trade engineering can solve. If the system is working so well, why do younger Nigerians feel increasingly shut out of it? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Younger Nigerians feel shut out because they are living the consequences, not the contracts. They didn't read the agreements. They didn't attend the banquets. They didn't sit in the rooms where alignment was framed as stability. They just grew up inside the results. Gen Z Nigerians came of age in a country that was always described as full of potential, yet permanently stuck in waiting mode. Waiting for reforms to work, waiting for security to improve, waiting for jobs that were always promised just one policy cycle away. They watched growth figures rise while everyday life stayed fragile. They heard the language of partnership while power cuts, inflation, and unemployment became normal. So when they see foreign troops arrive quietly, they don't see protection. They see continuity. When they see royal pageantry, they don't see respect. They see endorsement of the same arrangement. And when they hear about trade deals, they don't imagine opportunity. They imagine rules that will be enforced on them, not for them. This generation is different because it compares outcomes, not narratives. Older generations were trained to believe that proximity to global power eventually brings local benefit. Gen Z doesn't assume that anymore. They've seen decades of cooperation produce dependence, not strength. They've seen security assistance coexist with insecurity. They've seen economic integration coexist with exclusion. So their rejection isn't emotional, it's analytical. They aren't asking, does the West like us? They're asking, who actually controls decisions? And once that question is asked, symbolism stops working. A handshake with royalty doesn't explain why wages stagnate. Military cooperation doesn't explain why violence persists. Trade frameworks don't explain why young people remain locked out of ownership, capital, and influence. This is the crack in the system. Because legitimacy used to flow downward. Leaders were validated abroad, then accepted at home. That flow is reversing. Gen Z Nigerians judge leadership locally first. Foreign praise now raises suspicion instead of confidence, and that creates a problem for the architecture built around Nigeria. Nigeria was expected to be predictable, a stabilizer, a counterweight, a pillar. But predictability requires consent. And consent is evaporating among the largest, youngest segment of the population. That doesn't mean rebellion tomorrow. It means friction. It means skepticism. It means that every foreign-aligned decision now carries political cost instead of political cover. And when a country as large as Nigeria develops that kind of internal tension, it stops being a passive anchor. It starts becoming unstable in a different way, not violent, but ideologically restless. That restlessness is contagious. Young people across the region are watching Nigeria closely, not for speeches, but for signals. Whether Nigeria absorbs pressure quietly or pushes back in subtle ways, which leads directly to the question Western planners are trying to get ahead of. If Nigeria's youth no longer buy the old legitimacy story, what role is Nigeria supposed to play next? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Nigeria's next role is already being sketched, not announced, not debated, just assumed. The system is preparing Nigeria to function as a shock absorber. As the Sahel breaks away, someone has to absorb the consequences without letting the structure collapse. Someone has to remain cooperative enough to keep security corridors open, trade routes stable, financial flows predictable, and regional institutions alive. That someone is Nigeria. This role doesn't require speeches or formal agreements. It operates through expectation. Nigeria is expected to stay calm while others radicalize. Nigeria is expected to negotiate while others confront. Nigeria is expected to reassure investors, while others scare them. Nigeria is expected to be responsible. That word, responsible, does a lot of work here. Responsibility, in this context, doesn't mean serving Nigerian interests first. It means preventing disruption to a system that depends on Nigeria's size, population, and influence to remain functional. Nigeria becomes the country that makes sure things don't break too badly when pressure builds elsewhere. This is why Nigeria is being given protection, legitimacy, and access, not power. Anchors don't get to move freely. They get reinforced so they can hold weight. The problem is that this role quietly shifts the burden inward. Nigeria absorbs regional instability, external expectations, and internal frustration all at once. It is asked to carry contradictions that other countries are now rejecting outright. And the cost of that role is never paid up front. It shows up later. It shows up when Nigeria hesitates to take bold positions because the region needs stability. It shows up when security decisions prioritize partnerships over outcomes. It shows up when economic policy avoids disruption even when disruption is necessary. In short, Nigeria is being asked to manage decline, not escape it. That might work for institutions. It doesn't work forever for people, because the same Gen Z population that sees through legitimacy theater also understands when a country is being used to slow change rather than lead it. And once that realization sets in, the anchor role becomes politically radioactive. Nigeria's leadership can balance this role for a while. It can extract benefits. It can negotiate better terms. It can delay consequences. But it cannot erase the underlying tension, being central to the system while being constrained by it. Eventually, pressure accumulates. Anchors don't fail quietly. They fail when the force pulling them forward exceeds the force holding them down. And that's where Nigeria is drifting, toward a moment where staying predictable becomes more dangerous than becoming unpredictable. The system understands this risk. That's why everything is happening now, not later. That's why alignment is being reinforced before dissent hardens into direction. Which brings us to the final question that everything now circles. When the pressure becomes unbearable, will Nigeria hold the system together, or will it move and force the system to change with it? When the pressure becomes unbearable, Nigeria won't announce a break. It will signal it. That's how power shifts actually happen, not with declarations, but with decisions that quietly stop fitting the old script. The moment of choice won't come as a referendum on the West or a speech about sovereignty. It will arrive disguised as technical questions, small ones, seemingly boring ones, the kind most people ignore until they stack up. Who controls security data when interests diverge? Who arbitrates when contracts block industrial policy? Who sets digital rules when platforms extract more than they build? Who decides when stability starts costing more than change? These decisions will expose the truth. If Nigeria continues to choose predictability over leverage, it remains the anchor. Protected, consulted, invited, but constrained. The system survives longer, even as dissatisfaction deepens underneath. Change slows. Pressure stays internal. If Nigeria starts choosing leverage over predictability, the reaction will be immediate. Concerned headlines, investor anxiety, diplomatic pressure, quiet warnings about risk and responsibility. The system doesn't punish defiance loudly anymore. It isolates it politely. But here's what makes this moment different from every previous one. Nigeria is no longer deciding alone. The population is young, connected, impatient, and globally aware. They don't need ideology handed to them. They already know when outcomes don't match promises. They already understand when a country is being managed instead of being empowered. That awareness shortens the lifespan of compromise. Previous generations could tolerate being the stabilizer because they believed stability would eventually deliver progress. This generation sees stability as maintenance of a structure that no longer serves them. For them, uncertainty feels less dangerous than stagnation. That changes the cost calculation. Nigeria can no longer absorb pressure indefinitely without something giving way, either internally or externally. And the more the system leans on Nigeria to hold everything together, the more visible that burden becomes. This is why the timing matters so much. The airstrikes, the state visit, the trade frameworks, they're not signs of confidence. They're signs of anticipation. The system isn't reacting to rebellion, it's bracing for it, trying to lock in alignment before restlessness turns into direction. But direction doesn't come from permission. It comes from accumulation. Enough frustration. Enough blocked options. Enough watching others experiment while you're asked to behave. Nigeria hasn't crossed that threshold yet, but it's close enough that everyone can feel it, even if no one says it out loud. And that's why this story isn't about what Nigeria has done. It's about what Nigeria will do when the old role stops paying its price. So the real question now isn't whether Nigeria is powerful, important, or strategic. It's this: when the moment arrives, will Nigeria continue to absorb pressure for a system that's fading, or will it move and force the entire structure to adjust around it? Let us know in the comment section. Is colonialism back in Nigeria? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.